8 blows for an alien child. He awoke, surrounded by warriors. The atrium of Vorkai Station was wide and cold and lit by pale yellow lights that never changed, no matter what time it was. There was no day or night here, only the hum of recycled air and the low noise of 100 different species going about their business. Merchants moving cargo, travelers checking route boards, to dock workers eating meals at standing counters. All of it loud and constant and ordinary. Dara Selen had been on her way back from the commissary with a cold cup of something that was supposed to be coffee when she stopped walking. The atrium below her observation tier had gone quiet, and Vorkai Station was never quiet. Not really. So when it happened, the absence of sound landed on her like a hand on her shoulder, firm and deliberate. And she stopped and looked down over the railing and saw the crowd. Every species on the station had seemed to find its way into that atrium. She could see Voss traders with their 4 arms folded tight against their narrow chests, Denari merchants in their layered travel cloaks, a cluster of Orathi dock supervisors standing in a group near the east wall. All of them had stopped moving. All of them were looking at the same point on the atrium floor. And none of them were speaking. She looked to where they were looking, and she saw the tribunal. There were 7 Katur standing in a wide half-circle at the center of the floor, enormous even by the standards of their species, each one in gray and black ceremonial armor, the kind the Katur reserved for proceedings they considered sacred. Their scaled faces were flat and unreadable, as their yellow eyes fixed on the figure bound in the center of their formation. The figure in the center was young. He was Katur too, but barely. His scales still had the pale gray color of a juvenile who had not yet reached full maturity, and he had not grown to the height his species reached in adulthood. He was perhaps 6.5 feet tall, which would have been large for a human but was small for what he was. His wrists were bound behind him with iron chain. The thick loops of it fastened with a lock the size of her fist, and the chain ran down to a spike driven into the station floor. He was not fighting the chain. He stood straight, his shoulders back, his head level, and he looked at the floor in front of him with an expression she could not read. From where she stood, Captain Ose appeared at her left shoulder without making any noise, which was a habit of his she had never fully adjusted to. He was a tall man with close-cut gray at his temples, and the kind of face that had been worn smooth by years of keeping calm in rooms where calm was the hardest thing to maintain. "What is this?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "Tribunal proceeding," Ose said. "Katur ritual law. The boy refused to execute a prisoner during a border engagement. His own clan filed the charge." Dara looked down at the young Katur, so at the way he was standing, at the chain on his wrists. "A prisoner," she said. "A juvenile combatant, barely old enough to carry a weapon by their own classification. The boy picked him up off the field instead of finishing him, carried him to a neutral medical point under fire. The tribunal considers it a catastrophic failure of honor. A stain on his bloodline and his clan's standing." "And what happens now?" Ose was quiet for a moment. 8 blows, he said. "Ceremonial, each one delivered by a different tribunal elder in sequence. The rods they use are treated with a mineral compound that prevents the wounds from healing cleanly. It is not designed to kill immediately. It is designed to last. Survivors are stripped of all clan standing and exiled as Kethless. Most do not survive." Dara set her coffee cup on a railing and did not pick it up again. The senior tribunal elder at the head of the half-circle raised his rod. It was a dark, heavy thing, thick as a man's wrist and about 4 feet long, and even from the tier above she could see the faint discoloration on its surface where the compound had dried. The elder spoke a short formal phrase in Katur, and the atrium, which had already been quiet, went quieter still. And in the way a room goes quiet when the last person in it has stopped breathing, the first blow landed. It was fast, and it was hard, and the sound it made carried all the way up to the observation tier where Dara was standing, a sharp, flat crack that she felt in her back teeth. The young Katur lurched forward with the force of it, but he did not fall, and he did not cry out. And after a moment he straightened himself and looked at the floor again. "Don't," Osei said. She had not moved. She was still at the railing with both hands on it. But he had known her long enough to read the direction of a thing before it arrived, and he said it again, quiet and direct. "Don't, warrant officer." The second blow landed. The young Katur's legs buckled. He went down on one knee and stayed there, breathing through his nose, not moving, not making a sound. And then he pushed himself back up to standing with the chain rattling against the floor spike. And he looked at the same spot on the floor he had been looking at before, and he was still straight, still quiet, and still holding something inside himself that Dara could not name, but could not stop looking at. She thought about what Osei had said. A juvenile combatant, barely old enough. And she thought about this young Katur standing in a half-circle of his own elders taking a punishment built to destroy him, for the specific crime of choosing not to kill a child. She thought about the second blow and the way his legs had buckled and the way he had gotten back up anyway. She let go of the railing. "Solen," Osei said, and there was an edge in it now. The voice he used when he had already said a thing once and meant it more the second time. "I heard you," she said. The third tribunal elder was moving into position below, stepping forward, adjusting his grip on the rod, settling his weight. And Dara turned and walked quickly to the end of the observation tier, where the emergency access ladder was bolted to the wall. "That is a sacred proceeding. You have no jurisdiction on that floor. You will start an incident that neither of us can contain." "I know," she said. She climbed over the railing. She dropped. It was 9 meters to the atrium floor, and she had done worse in training. She hit the ground and rolled hard to her left. Came up on both feet with her knees bent and her breath punched out of her chest, and she stood up between the third elder and the young Katur with one open hand raised, breathing hard, with her coffee cup somewhere up on the railing behind her going cold. The crowd went completely, absolutely silent. She was a medium-height human woman in an off-duty jacket with a coffee stain on the left cuff, standing inside a Katur sacred tribunal with one hand up, and then every living thing in that atrium was looking at her. She looked at the elder in front of her, and in the worst, most fractured Katur she had ever produced in her life. She said the words she had spent the last 30 seconds retrieving from the back of her memory, the formal phrase from the interspecies station accord, the one she had read once in a legal briefing 2 years ago and had never expected to actually use. "I claim witness right. The sentence is seen. The debt is marked." The elder stared at her. The crowd stared at her. She did not move. Above her, on the observation tier, she heard Osei open his comm, his voice low and controlled, the way it got when a situation had already become what it was, and there was nothing left to do but manage it. "All UN personnel." This is not a drill." The 40 seconds that followed were the longest she had ever stood still in her life. The elder in front of her was not moving. He was working through the legal weight of what she had said because witness right was real. It was in the charter, and invoking it incorrectly would void the tribunal's own standing before the council. She could see him calculating, his jaw moving slightly, on his yellow eyes on her face with the flat attention of a person reading a document. She held his gaze and kept her hand up and breathed. Then the senior elder, the one who had delivered the first blow, stepped past her, went directly to the young Katur and raised his rod, and then turned without warning and brought it down across Dara's left shoulder and collarbone instead. She heard the crack before she felt it, a sharp, flat sound. And then the pain arrived, white and immediate. I spreading down her left arm and up the side of her neck, and her knees tried to buckle, and she told them no in the specific way you tell a thing that is about to do something wrong, and her knees held barely. She did not step back. She did not reach for her sidearm. She stood with her arm hanging, and she looked at the elder who had just hit her, and she did not move. And the look on her face was not rage and not fear, but something steadier and quieter than either. And then the senior elder looked back at her, and for the first time in that entire proceeding, something shifted in his expression. Something small and uncertain that had not been there before. From the east wall of the atrium, a service hatch opened. Corporal Yemi Adaze was not a large man. He was about Dara's height, compact and even, with a face that looked completely calm in all situations, regardless of what those situations were. He had a wire cutter in one hand and a protein bar in the other. And he moved through the chaos of the atrium crowd with the specific unhurried speed of someone who had already thought through what they were about to do and made peace with it. He went directly to the young Katur. He cut the chain at the connection loop between the wrist bindings, pulled the spike from the floor with one hard yank, slung the young Katur over his left shoulder like a piece of equipment. Yaman turned back toward the service hatch without breaking stride. The young Katur was not fully unconscious. He made a sound of protest and pushed against Yemi's shoulder with one hand, something between a snarl and a word. And Yemi said, then in the calm and reasonable tone of a person explaining something that should have already been obvious, "I've got you. Stop fighting. We're leaving." The atrium was not calm anymore. The crowd had been still and breathless through the entire tribunal proceeding, but the moment the chain was cut and Yemi started moving, everything broke open at once. Not screaming, not panic, but the sudden surge of 100 different voices in 100 different languages all reacting at the same time. The sound of a space that had been holding its breath for too long finally letting go. Cargo drones overhead that had been hovering in holding patterns began to drift as their operators lost focus, and station security personnel were pushing in from 3 different corridor entrances, trying to read a situation that had changed 3 times in the last 90 seconds. The tribunal guards in Katur armor were moving in from the north side of the atrium, 6 of them, heavy and fast. And in the crowd between them and Yemi was the only thing slowing them down. Dara turned and ran. Her left arm was pressed tight against her chest, and the pain in her collarbone was a specific, unpleasant presence with every footfall. But she had done harder things hurt, and she moved fast. She wove through the crowd, stepped over a spilled crate of something that smelled like engine sealant, and ducked under a cargo drone that was circling in panicked, slow loops near the ceiling. She made it through the service hatch 3 seconds after Yemi, and the hatch shut behind her with a solid mechanical click. The maintenance corridor was dark and narrow and smelled of hot metal and old pipe compound. The only light came from the faint orange indicator strips along the floor, just enough to see your feet. Yemi was already moving ahead of her, turning left at the first junction without slowing, the young Katur still over his shoulder. Dara followed, breathing through the pain, navigating by the orange glow. "Collarbone," she said between breaths. "I heard it from the tier," Yemi said, not slowing. "How bad?" "Cracked. Not broken through. I can run." "You are running. That answers the question." Through the hatch and the wall and 2 layers of hull plating behind them, they could hear the tribunal guards. The Katur language carried even through solid material, deep and percussive, the sound of a search beginning rather than a chase. Systematic, not panicked. The guards had not followed them through the service hatch, yet because the hatch was human-sized and Katur tribunal armor was not, and taking the armor off in a public atrium was not something the tribunal would do, not for this, not with the whole station watching. They had minutes, not many. But some Yemi took a right, then a left, moving deeper into the maintenance warrens, through a section where the ceiling dropped low enough that Dara had to tilt her head, and then up into a wider passage, where the heat exchange units lined the walls like great metal ribs, radiating warmth into the dark corridor. The young Katur on Yemi's shoulder had stopped struggling and gone quiet, either conserved or unconscious, and Dara could see the wounds on his back even in the low light, 2 marks left by the first and second blows, dark against his pale juvenile scales, and she set her jaw and kept moving. Above them, on the UN communication frequency, Captain Osei's voice came through flat and even, the voice he used when things had gone somewhere complicated and he was going to deal with it anyway. All personnel, secure the contingent quarters. I need a medic at secondary hatch, east lower ring. 5 minutes. And someone tell me we have field splinting gear because I suspect we are going to need it immediately. Yemi, still moving, still carrying an injured alien teenager through a dark maintenance corridor, took a bite of his protein bar. He's going to be furious with us, he said. Extremely. Dara said, worth it? She thought about the second blow, about the way the young Katur had gone down on one knee and gotten back up in silence. Not because he had to, but because he had already decided what kind of person he was, and that kind of person stood up. And she thought about what Osei had told her on the tier, the prisoner, the child who had been left alive because of the boy on Yemi's shoulder. Yes, she said. They found the room 20 minutes later, a maintenance pocket behind a water recycling junction about the size of a large storage closet, and with a pressure door that locked from the inside and a ventilation shaft that gave enough airflow to breathe. Yemi had found it 3 weeks prior during a routine walkthrough, out of habit, the way he found all the exits and all the hiding spots in every place he was ever stationed, quietly and without making a record of it. He set the young Katur down against the wall and opened the field medical kit. The young Katur opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling, then at Dara, then at Yemi, and the yellow eyes were sharp even through the fever. His scales had the faint flush of elevated temperature, and his hands were slightly unsteady, but he was coherent, and the first coherent thing he did was attempt to stand up. "Stay down," Yemi said, not looking up from the kit. "I need to. You need to stay down. You have open wounds on your back and a fever, and you are in a maintenance corridor on a space station. Stay down." The young Katur stayed down, but his jaw was tight. "You have made a very serious mistake," he said. His galactic standard was clean and precise, each word placed carefully. "I am not saying this as an expression of frustration. I am telling you as a fact. What you have done will create problems for your people that go beyond this station." "I understand," Dara said. "What is your name?" A pause. The yellow eyes moved to her face. "Surak," he said. "I am Dara. That is Yemi. We are human. In case that part was not clear." "It was clear," Surak said. "You are human, and you have removed me from a Katur sacred tribunal by force. Do you understand what Keth is?" "Honor debt," Dara said. "Standing among your people. It is more than that. It is the structure by which everything is measured. Clan, rank, the right to be heard, the right to act, the right to be remembered. The 8 blows were mine to complete. If I had completed them, even destroyed by them, I would have had something remaining. I would have had the record of endurance. Now I have nothing, because I was carried from the floor of my own tribunal by a human, which is not something that has words in my language for how it sits." He said all of this without heat, without self-pity, just flat and factual. It's the way a person describes the contents of a room, and Dara listened to all of it and did not argue. Yemi finished closing the second wound on Surak's back. The young Katur had not made a sound throughout this, not even when Yemi had to press hard on the first wound to manage the bleeding. And then Yemi stood, looked at Dara, and said, "Your turn," in a tone that left no room for negotiation. He ran his hands along her collarbone and made a quiet, unhappy sound. "2 places," he said. "Not displaced. You are lucky. This is going to hurt while I set it." "Do it," she said. It did hurt. She breathed through it through her nose, hard and even, and Yemi worked fast with the field kit. And when it was done, he strapped her arm across her chest with the splint and looked at her with the expression of a person who has decided not to say what they are thinking. "You dropped 9 meters," he said. "I'm saying it anyway. I rolled. You took a tribunal rod to the collarbone. I didn't move, though." Yemi looked at her for a moment, and then at Surak, and then back at her. "No," he said. "You didn't." Surak had been watching all of this. The exchange between them, the ease of it, the way they spoke to each other without ceremony or rank language. And something in his expression had changed slightly from when he had first opened his eyes. Not much. Not in any way he would have named. But it was there. "Why did you do this?" he said. Not the accusatory version of the question this time, just the question itself, plain and direct. "Because you were being beaten for refusing to kill a child," Dara said. "It was not a child by Katur classification. The prisoner was a combatant." "When you looked at him," Dara said, "not by classification, by your own eyes, was he a child?" Surak was quiet. She waited. He did not answer, but the silence was its own answer, and she could see him deciding something in it, some small interior door opening or closing. And after a moment, slowly, he began to talk. He told them about the border skirmish, and about his father who had died there, and about the prisoner. 12 years old by human count, small even for that. "I conscripted into a militia that had been using children as fighters for 3 years. The boy had been shot twice and was not going to survive without care. Surak's unit had been ordered to clear the field before extraction. Clearing the field meant what it meant. Surak had looked at the boy on the ground, and he had made a choice. He had picked him up and carried him 2 kilometers under fire to a neutral medical station and handed him to a trauma team and walked back to his own unit. And then he had known while he was walking back exactly what was coming for him, and he had come back anyway." Yemi handed Surak a water ration. Surak took it without thinking, drank, and then looked at the container in his hand as if noticing it for the first time. And something about that small moment, the simple unthinking act of being handed something and having it be there, it seemed to reach him in a way the words had not. "My youngest brother is 11, Yemi said. "We call him B. If someone handed him a weapon and told him to fight, I would not be calm about it. None of us would, not for a second." Surak looked at him. Yemi said nothing else. He did not need to. The statement sat in the small, warm room and was enough through the walls of the maintenance warren, further up in the corridors above them. Then heavy footsteps moved in slow and deliberate patterns. Katur armor, not rushing, not panicking, just moving through the station's lower ring the way water moves through channels, filling every space, patient and thorough. They were not chasing. They were searching. And searching was worse. Dara looked at Yemi. "Time to the contingent quarters," she said. 12 minutes fast. Longer if we route around the heat exchange section to avoid the patrol level." "Go around," she said, and she looked at Surak. "Can you walk?" He looked at his hands, then at the floor. Then he pushed himself to his feet slowly in the low-ceilinged room, standing at his full height with his head bent at an angle against the pipes above. He was steady, barely, at the fever still present in his eyes, but the will behind them stronger than the fever. "Yes," he said. "Good," Dara said, and the 3 of them moved back into the dark. The maintenance warrens beneath Vorkai Station's lower ring were not designed for comfort. They were designed for pipes and wiring and conduit runs and the steady invisible work that kept a station functioning without anyone in the upper rings ever needing to think about it. The ceilings were low in most sections and then suddenly high in others where heat exchange units hung from the walls like great metal organs, breathing warm air into the dark in slow rhythmic pulses. The floors were grated in some places and solid in others, and the whole system smelled of hot metal and the specific chemical bitterness of machine lubricant that had been there long enough to become part of the air. They moved through it for 12 minutes. Yemi went first, navigating from memory, choosing junctions by the color codes painted on the pipes at each turn: blue for water, yellow for power, red for ventilation. And behind him Dara walked with her splinted arm pressed to her chest, watching the corridors ahead and behind. And behind her, Surak moved in careful steps, slightly bent at the head to clear the low sections, breathing through the fever with the deliberate control of someone who has decided that the fever does not get to win right now. He had not said anything since the maintenance pocket. This was not the silence of unconsciousness or collapse. It was the silence of someone thinking very hard about something they had not expected to be thinking about, and it sat in the corridor with them the whole 12 minutes, heavier than the dark. They came up into the east lower ring through a ventilation access at the far end of a supply corridor, and Corporal Yemi opened the pressure door to the UN contingent's emergency quarters with his biometric clearance, and they went through. And then Captain Ose was standing inside the door. He was a tall man, and he seemed to fill the small entry space without trying. He looked at the three of them the way a person looks at the result of something they knew was going to happen, but had hoped might not. At Dara with the splinted arm and the bruise coming up dark on the left side of her neck, at Yemi who was still eating the same protein bar, and at Surak who was 6.5 feet of injured juvenile couture, standing in the doorway of a human military quarters with fever in his eyes and chain marks on his wrists. "Right," Ose said. "Let's get the medic in and make some extremely uncomfortable diplomatic calls." The medic was Specialist Harun, a quiet woman with short braided hair and very steady hands. She looked at Surak's back with an expression that was professionally neutral, and then went to work with the kind of focused calm that made Dara trust her immediately. The field kit Yemi had used in the maintenance pocket had managed the bleeding, but the wounds needed proper closure and the fever needed management. And Harun worked through both without rushing and without unnecessary words. Surak submitted to this without protest, which surprised Dara more than anything else he had done. She had expected resistance, at the same instinct toward refusal that had driven him to try to crawl back to the atrium floor when he had first come around. But he sat still under Harun's hands and looked at the opposite wall and breathed. When Harun was done, she gave Dara a second look at the collarbone and confirmed that Yemi's field splinting was correct and that she should keep the arm still for 2 weeks, and that she was lucky the break was not displaced, and that dropping from observation tiers was generally not. "Are recommended," she said this last part without inflection, like a person reading from a manual, and Dara said "noted," and Harun moved on. Ose came back from the comm room with the expression of someone who has had a very long series of conversations in a very short amount of time. "The tribunal has filed a formal Keth demand with the station council," he said. "They want Surak returned to complete the remaining 4 blows, or every human on this station expelled and the contingent flagged as Keth breakers in their space. The flag would affect trade routes significantly. People well above my rank will be receiving communications about this within hours." Dara looked at him. And I am going to go sit across a table from the senior elder and negotiate for as long as I can," Ose said. "But I want you to understand clearly what we are doing here." "The warrant officer. We are not doing it halfway. We are doing it all the way, which means you stay in these quarters with Surak until I know what the shape of this is." "Understood," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at things he had already decided about. "Good," he said, and left. Surak had been moved to one of the bunk rooms, and Harun had given him something for the fever. He was lying on the narrow cot with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. But when Dara came to check on him, he looked at her sideways and did not speak. She sat against the wall across from him, and was quiet, too, for a while. "Your captain is going to negotiate for my return," Surak said. It was not a question. He is going to negotiate, Dara said. He is not going to succeed, but he is going to try every angle he knows first. And because that is what he does. Why will he not succeed? Because this is not the kind of thing that has a middle position. There is no compromise version of what they want. Either you go back or you don't. Surak was quiet. You don't have to look worried, Dara said. You're not going back. I am not worried, Surak said. I am trying to understand you. What part? All of it, he said, and he turned his head back to the ceiling. Your species does not make sense to me. You are a mid-tier civilization by any measure, short-lived, physically fragile, and with a history of internal conflict that would disqualify any Ka-Tur clan from serious consideration in galactic standing, and yet you dropped from a tier 9 meters above a Ka-Tur tribunal floor with a coffee cup in your hand and stood in front of an elder with one hand raised, for a person you had never met. I didn't have the coffee cup when I dropped, Dara said. I left it on the railing. Surak looked at her. The 9 meters is accurate, though, she said. He was quiet again, and something in the quiet this time was different from before. Not the closed silence of suspicion or the calculating silence of a person working through threat assessments. It was closer to the silence of someone who does not know what to do with a thing and is sitting with it honestly. My father died in the engagement, he said, the same one where I took the prisoner. She did not say anything. She waited. He was a tribunal elder himself, not of this tribunal, and a different one. He had served for 31 years. When my unit received the order to clear the field, I knew exactly what my father would have done. He would have cleared the field. He would have done it without hesitation and without doubt, and he would have been correct by every standard of our law and our tradition. And I looked at the prisoner on the ground, and I could not do it. He said it the same way he said everything, flat and precise. But underneath the flatness, there was a weight that had been in him a long time. Do you regret it? Dara said. No, he said. No pause, and no uncertainty. I have regretted nothing except not knowing whether the boy lived. We could find out, Dara said. He looked at her again, and this time there was something in the yellow eyes that she had not seen there before. Something open and undefended that had not been there when he woke up angry on the maintenance corridor floor. He did not say anything, but she took it as a yes and made a note of it. Yemi appeared in the doorway with 2 water rations and a second protein bar. He handed the water to Surak and kept the protein bar for himself and sat on the floor by the door with his back against the wall. How is the fever, he said. Present, Surak said. That's honest. Did Harun give you something for it? Yes. Then let it work. Stop being awake at it. It doesn't help. Yemi opened his protein bar. My brother Tobechukwu used to fight his fever when he was small. Would sit up and argue with everyone who told him to rest. Would not give in. My mother called it the family stubbornness. Said it skipped no one. Surak watched Yemi eat the protein bar with an expression that was not quite confusion and not quite curiosity, but somewhere between the two. Do you have family? He said. And it was the first question he had asked that was not. Not about the situation or the consequences or the tactical shape of things. It was just a question, the kind people ask when they are beginning to exist in the same space rather than only occupying it. 3 brothers, Yemi said. Ikeni is the oldest after me. He works in atmospheric engineering on the 2nd colony station. Tobechukwu is middle. He is a teacher. And B, the youngest, and he is 11, and he is the smartest one, and we have not told him yet because we do not need him to know. Something moved in Surak's expression, not quite a smile. The Ka-Tur face was not built for smiling, but the equivalent of it, a slight easing at the corners of the mouth, a relaxation in the jaw. I had a sister, he said. She died 4 years ago. A training accident. She was 2 years younger than me. Yemi nodded. not with sympathy exactly, more with the simple acknowledgement of one person recognizing the shape of a loss in another. "I am sorry," he said, and he said it the way he said everything, direct and without decoration, which made it mean more than a longer thing would have. From the comm room, Osei's voice carried through the wall, low and patient and going nowhere. He had been at the table with the tribunal's senior elder for 3 hours by this point, working every angle. Finding every angle closed, and through the walls of the station the sound of heavy armor in the maintenance corridors had not stopped, slow and methodical, moving through the station's lower levels like a tied surak, lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling, and the fever worked in him, and the compound in his wounds did what it was designed to do, and Yemi sat by the door and did not leave, and Dara stayed against the wall. And the station moved around them like a world going about its business, while a smaller and more important world existed quietly in one room of it. After a while, Surak's eyes closed. Yemi looked at Dara across the room, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that the room was not already saying. And outside the pressure door of the contingent quarters, other footsteps were beginning to gather, quiet and purposeful, from directions no one had organized or planned. Captain Osei had been in rooms like this before. Small rooms with bad chairs and a table that rocked on uneven footing and lighting that was either too bright or too dim and never anything between. He had been in rooms like this in 4 different star systems and on 24 stations and in a handful of places that did not appear on any navigation chart in any official database. And he had sat across from people who wanted things he could not. She give them and held the line without drama and without apology, because holding the line was the work, and he had chosen the work. The room the station had given them was Vorkai's primary diplomatic meeting chamber, which was a generous name for what was essentially a storage bay with a folding table in it and a translation unit mounted to the wall. The chairs were the kind that felt immediately wrong regardless of how you sat in them, and as if they had been designed by someone who had read a description of sitting but had never done it. Vethkas sat across from him. He was the senior elder of the Katur Tribunal, the one who had delivered the first blow in the atrium, and he was approximately 8.5 feet tall, broad at the shoulder, wearing the formal ceremonial armor that the Katur used for proceedings of consequence. He smelled faintly of the mineral compound from the tribunal rods, cold and chemical, and he had 7 advisors standing behind him, all in armor, all watching Osei with the attentive stillness of people filing information for later use. Osei had no advisors. He had Preth, a station liaison of the small 4-armed Voss species, sitting to his left with a translation feed running, and Preth had the specific look of a person who was sincerely regretting their career choices for the first time in a long while. The Keth demand had been filed 4 hours ago, formally, through the station council with all the correct documentation and the correct seals and the correct interspecies charter citations. It was valid, and everyone in the room knew it was valid, and that was the first wall Osei had hit when he sat down. He had tried the procedural angle first. Dara's witness right invocation had created a legitimate legal pause before the elder struck her, which meant the tribunal had violated its own standing by continuing the proceeding, which could be argued as rendering the remaining 4 blows administratively void. He had made this argument in careful, formal language, and Vethkas had listened to it with the expression of a cliff face, and then a Katur legal advisor behind him had pointed out 2 charter clauses that closed that interpretation. That on the wall stayed up. He had tried the humanitarian exception framework next. The Interspecies Station Accord had provisions for intervention in proceedings deemed to constitute disproportionate harm under a universal standard, and he had prepared this argument in the hours before the meeting, had built it carefully, and Vethkas had listened to this too, the same cliff face. and then explained in 2 sentences that Katur's sacred law was explicitly exempted from that provision under the original treaty, and the wall stayed up. He had offered compensatory Keth recognition, a formal joint ceremony before the station council, publicly acknowledging the tribunal's authority and the validity of their law, with a written record entered into station archives. This one he had invented on the spot. But he phrased it with enough precision that Preth had looked at him sideways with something close to admiration. Vethkos had declined this too, not dismissively, not with contempt, but simply. The way a fact declines to change, because you have asked it politely. They had been at the table for 6 hours. Osei sat back in his bad chair and looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at Vethkos, and he said very calmly, "Me through Preth's translation feed, I want you to understand that I cannot return the young man to your tribunal. Not because of any legal argument I have made in this room, and not because of jurisdiction or protocol, but because it is not something my people are built to do. I want you to understand that this is not a position. It is simply true." Vethkos looked at him for a long moment. "Then the Keth demand stands," he said. "You have 48 hours. Osei nodded. "I understand," he said, and he stood up and left the room. And he walked directly from the diplomatic chamber to the east lower ring without stopping. The contingent quarters were at the far end of a long, straight corridor, and Osei could see the door from the junction where the corridor began. But he could also see everything between him and the door. And he stopped walking. The corridor was full. Not just UN personnel. The contingent was 12 people, and there were far more than 12 people in that corridor. He counted quickly. 31. Am I standing in the passage in front of the pressure door with no particular formation and no weapons drawn, just standing there in the flat, patient way of people who have arrived somewhere and decided to stay? He recognized some of them and not others. Merchant Captain Isolde was near the front, a lean woman with close-cropped silver hair who ran a 2-ship trade operation out of the outer belt. And she had 5 of her crew behind her, and a length of conduit pipe in her right hand that she was holding with the calm grip of someone who has made a decision. Beside her were Kwabena and Dimitri, the 2 dock workers from loading Bay 4 on Level 3, men built like structural supports, who had once, in Osei's direct observation, stopped a runaway cargo pallet with their hands and then argued about whose fault it had been. Further back were 3 xenobiologists from the research annex, 2 women and a man, all of them clearly frightened and none of them moving. A food stall operator from the mid-ring market was there with her teenage daughter standing close behind her. A retired engineer whose name Osei did not know stood near the wall with a heavy wrench in his left hand, holding it the way someone holds a thing they hope they will not have to use. And in the back, a man in kitchen work clothes whose name Osei did not know at all, who appeared to have come directly from his shift without changing. They were not organized. Nobody had gathered them. Nobody had sent a message. Nobody had issued instructions. They had simply come, one by one and in small groups, because word moves on a space station the way water moves on a flat surface, finding every low path, reaching every connected place. And what word had moved was the simple true thing that everyone who had been in that atrium understood. A young being had been beaten for choosing not to kill a child, and humans had stood in the way. And so, here were more humans. Standing in the way, Osei walked to the front of the 31 people and turned to face the north end of the corridor and did not say a word. Because there was nothing to say that they had not already said by being there. The sound of Ka-Tur armor came from the north junction, heavy and unhurried, multiple units moving in the systematic way of a search that has found what it was looking for. And they came around the corner, 6 tribunal guards in full armor, 2 senior officers, and behind them, Vethkos. The guards stopped. Vethkos stopped behind them and looked at the corridor. He looked at the faces. He did this slowly, and without any rush, one face at a time, beginning at the front and moving back through the group. He looked at Ose, and at Isolde with her conduit pipe, and at the dock workers, and at the xenobiologists who were scared and present, and at the stall operator and her daughter, and at the man in the kitchen clothes at the back. He took his time and he missed nothing, and the corridor was very quiet while he did it. He had fought humans before, in border engagements near the outer territories, in two separate incidents that had never appeared in joint historical records, and he knew what human soldiers were. And he had measured them against his own people's standard and found them mortal and fragile and brief, shorter-lived than almost any other species in that part of the galaxy, soft-bodied, without armor of their own. Now, without the natural physical advantages that most warrior species developed over thousands of years of evolution, he knew all of this. But what he was looking at now was not what he had fought on the border. What he was looking at was 31 people who were not soldiers, not most of them, who had no unit and no order and no rank structure to hold them in place, who had nothing binding them to that corridor except their own decision. And they were not angry, were not shouting, were not making the loud display his own people sometimes made before a confrontation. They were simply present, in the way of a wall that has always been there. There was no performance in it. They had just come and they had stood there and they were still standing. And there was something in the quality of that stillness that landed in Vethkas's chest in a place he did not have a formal name for. A recognition that reached past his training and his law and his 40 years of service to something older and more basic in him, the part that understood weight when it felt weight. He stood there for a long moment. Then he looked past the 31 people to the pressure door behind them, and he said, not in the tribunal register, but not in the formal legal language of the Keth demand, but in a quieter register, one used for direct speech between people. I wish to speak to the young one. Ose looked at him. He had been reading Katur faces for 4 years, and what he saw in Vethkas's face now was not the cliff face he had sat across from in the diplomatic chamber for 6 hours. It was something else, and something he could not fully translate but could recognize the shape of. He turned and opened the pressure door and led Vethkas through. Surak dreamed of the field. He dreamed it the way you dream things you have lived, not as memory arranged in clean order, but as sensation without sequence, the way the body holds what the mind has tried to file away, the smoke smell, the weight of the prisoner in his arms. May the specific sound of 2 different sets of weapons firing from 2 different directions, the feeling of the boy's shallow breathing against his shoulder as he ran, the moment when his father's voice stopped coming through the comm and did not come back. He dreamed the atrium, too, the half-circle of elders, the floor under his feet, the second blow that put him on one knee. And in the dream he stood back up from the second blow and looked up for the first time, which he had not done in the real atrium, and the observation tier above him was full of people looking down, every species, every face different, all of them watching. He stood up in the dream, and he looked at all of them, looking at him. He woke up. The room was dim. Someone had covered part of the light panel with a piece of cloth, so the brightness was low and warm, and the color of late afternoon in a place that had late afternoons. The ceiling was close, and the air smelled of machine oil and something that was probably food, the human variety which had a sweetness to it that was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. He lay still for a moment and listened. There were voices nearby, low and unhurried, the quiet voices of people who are being quiet on purpose, making just enough sound to be present without disturbing. And there was the soft, rhythmic clicking of something, a card game by the sound of it, the specific sequence of placement and counting that his translator recognized even at low volume. He turned his head. Dara was against the wall to his left, asleep, sitting up with her back straight and her head tilted back slightly. The bruise on the left side of her neck had deepened in the hours since the atrium, and a wide dark mark that disappeared under her collar. She had not mentioned the bruise once. Not the whole time they had been moving through the maintenance warrens. Not when Harun had checked the collarbone. Not when Osei had come back from the diplomatic chamber with his face carrying the weight of 6 failed hours. She had simply not mentioned it. The way a person does not mention a thing they have decided is not the point. Yemi was in the chair to the right of the door, asleep. Arms folded on the small table, head resting on his arms in the way of a person who had sat down for 5 minutes and found that their body had other plans. There was a half-eaten protein bar on the table near his elbow. 2 men Suarak did not know were in the corner. Large men, the large specific to a species that does heavy physical work, with broad shoulders and the easy posture of people who are used to their own size. They were playing a card game, and they looked up when they saw his eyes open, and one of them raised a hand in a small, unhurried wave, casual and direct, as if this were perfectly normal, as if he were a neighbor who had dropped by and happened to be lying on the bunk. Surak had never in his life woken from injury to find anyone simply staying. In Kator culture, you woke to a medic and an assessment. You woke to function, to the next step, to the immediate question of what your status was and what the situation required. You did not wake to people who had arranged themselves around you in the dark and were playing cards quietly so as not to wake you, and who had covered the light so it would be gentler, who were present with no purpose except to be there in case you needed something. He lay still in the warmth of the room and looked at all of it, and felt something in his chest that was not the fever, and was not the pain from his back, and was not any emotion he had a word for in Katur or in Galactic Standard. It was something older than language, a something that went below the level of culture and law and Keth and everything he had been trained to measure himself against, and it sat in him, and it was quiet, and it was very large. The door opened. Vethkas came in alone. No advisors, no ceremonial armor, only the simple gray travel garment the Katur wore as ordinary clothing, the kind worn without rank insignia or tribunal markings. He came in and he stopped just inside the door, and he looked at the room. Dara asleep against the wall and Yemi asleep in the chair and the 2 dock workers with their cards. And he stood there and looked at it all for a moment, the way you look at a thing that is making you revise something you thought you understood. Then he moved to stand beside Surak's bunk. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the young Katur on the cot, at the bandaging on his back, at the chain marks on his wrists that Harun had treated, but that were still visible, and at the juvenile scales still carrying the gray-pale coloring of someone who had not yet fully grown, and something in his face moved, the face that had been flat and unreadable across the diplomatic table for 6 hours, the face of the senior elder and the tribunal head and the most senior Katur on the station. Then he spoke in the old dialect. It was not the formal Katur of the tribunal record. It was the tongue used between bloodkin, between elder and young, and in the private moments that were not for official history, and he spoke quietly, and Dara was asleep and Yemi was asleep, and Kwabena and Dimitri did not speak Katur, so it was only Suarak who heard it. What Vethkas said is not set down here, because it was not for the record and it was not for anyone else. It was the kind of words that belong to 2 people and to the space between them. And they stay there. But when he finished, and Surak's jaw was tight, and his eyes were fixed on the ceiling, and his hands, lying open at his sides on the thin cot mattress, had closed slowly into fists, and then opened again, finger by finger, like something releasing. Vethkas stood straight. He turned, and he looked at the room one more time. At Dara, at Yemi, at the 2 dock workers who had put their cards down and were watching him steadily, without challenge and without fear, just watching. And the way people watch when they are paying attention to something they want to understand. And he reached to the small comm unit on his wrist and opened the station's public broadcast channel, the the one that reached every speaker and every translation unit in every corridor of Vorkai Station. He began to speak names one by one, in Galactic Standard, slowly and clearly. Warrant Officer Dara Selene, Corporal Yemi Adaz, Captain Ose, Merchant Captain Isolde, and then her 5 crew members by name, each one, and then Kwabena, and then Dimitri, and then the 3 xenobiologists, and the stall operator, and the retired engineer, and the man in the kitchen clothes, whose name Vethkos knew, all 31, spoken into the station record by the senior elder of the Ka-Tur Tribunal in the formal register used for Keth recognition. In the history of the Ka-Tur, which was long and detailed and very carefully maintained, and this had never been done for a non-Ka-Tur person, not once, not in any archive, not in any oral tradition, not in any formal record that existed anywhere in the territories they held. Keth recognition was a thing given within the clan, to blood, to those who had earned standing through act, and it did not cross the boundary of species. Vethkos said every name. When he was finished, he closed the channel. He stood in the small room for one more moment, and then he said, and in the same quiet galactic standard, "The Keth demand is satisfied." And he turned and walked out of the room, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. The room was still Dara woke. The shift in the room had reached through her sleep. She looked at the closed door, then at Surak, then at Kwabena, who gave her a slow, single nod that said everything it needed to say without using a word. She looked at Surak. "What did he say to you?" she said. "In the old dialect, what did he say?" Surak was quiet for a moment, and his eyes did not come down from the ceiling, and when he spoke, his voice was careful and even and very steady. He said that a warrior who chooses a child's life over his own honor has already endured a blow that no tribunal can measure. He said the remaining 4 blows were already paid. The room held that for a moment Yemi, who had woken up at some point during the naming without moving or making a sound, sat up slowly in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands, and looked at Surak with the simple, direct look of a person who is genuinely glad about how a thing turned out. Not triumphant, not relieved exactly, just glad. The way you are glad when something that should be all right turns out to be all right. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. He produced a protein bar. He held it out across the small distance between the chair and the bunk. Surak looked at it. "Ka-Tur cannot process human food," he said. "I know." Yemi said, "It would be nutritionally useless to me." "Yes. And the texture is... I have seen you eat those and the texture appears." "It is not great," Yemi agreed. "But it is what I have." Surak looked at the protein bar for another moment, and then he reached out and took it, and he unwrapped it slowly, and took a careful bite, and he chewed it with the specific expression of someone encountering something deeply unpleasant, who has decided not to say so out loud. Kwabena laughed, a low, warm sound from the corner, and Dimitri laughed too, and Dara, despite the collarbone and the bruise and the 6 hours of everything that had led to this room, they found that she was smiling. And Surak, who had no clan and no Keth and no tribunal standing and no formal place anywhere in the galaxy by the law of his own people, sat on a narrow bunk in a small warm room surrounded by people who had stayed. Durrani finished the protein bar. It tasted like compressed sawdust, with a chemical sweetness that lingered in the back of the throat and was clearly designed by people with very different priorities than his own. He finished it anyway. It was not home. He did not know yet what home would be or where, or whether the word would ever apply to him again the way it had before the border skirmish and the field and the prisoner and everything that came after. But it was a beginning. And in the small room with the cloth over the light and the card game in the corner and the quiet company of people who had simply decided to stay, it was, for now, enough.